I'm surprised that, I don't know, that should surprise me, but I am surprised that everybody doesn't know this story. Because if, I knew it well before I ever read it, because it's been duplicated in cartoons and movies. I mean, even if it wasn't the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the idea was. So I'm going to assume, regardless of the way you respond to this, that you know it, because you should know it. Basically, the story. It is probably his most famous work, and he is, well, you'll find out in a minute, he's not the greatest English writer. That's why we're reading him today and not Tuesday before the exam. We're reading it the Thursday and Friday after the exam. I'll skip this. This is who he was. He was a poet, novelist, essayist, writer, short stories, and travel stories. Travel stories, I don't know. Everything is, I think probably most travel stories are seen on TV now. You can buy big coffee table books about Israel or about Germany. But there was a time in the 1890s and so that people loved to write those things. They loved to read them, so they were popular. People did write them. People like to read about other countries because most people would never go there. The other thing about him, he was a prodigious writer. I mean, he produced a lot of books, more than I'm going to give you. I've been in antique stores and saw, I might go get one now, but I saw several books I had never heard of. I looked them on the internet, never heard of these books. And then he wrote a book I had read to my sons when they were young that I'd forgotten he wrote. So, I mean, I would just kind of, he was more of a writer and produced more than I thought. He's also a romantic adventurer and world traveler. He was sick as a child, and he continued to be sick as an adult. He had tuberculosis, and one of the treatments for that at those days was to be in climates that were conducive to health, like warmer climates. So he actually traveled and became a sailor and traveled in the South Pacific. He actually died in the South Pacific, in the island of British Samoa, and that's where he's buried. So you go to Scotland, if anybody's interested in that, they would never find his grave that I know of, unless the remains have been moved, but I think his remains are still in British Samoa. He was, by comparison, nothing seems, nothing about him or his books seem unconventional anymore, because the way we have gone in our country. But at the time, the Victorian period, he was very unconventional. He actually rebelled against his family. He was a Presbyterian and a Calvinist, and kind of rejected all that. But he did condemn hypocrisy. So I guess we tend to believe in this country that if you're a rat, if you do certain bad things, it makes it better if you just admit it. You know, if that's who I am. That somehow makes it better. We always seem to condemn hypocrisy worse than the sin itself. You know, so like it's bad to do the sin, but if you're hypocritical about it, you're worse. All right, and so that's his big thing. He hated hypocrisy. I guess he just wanted to be out there. If you're going to be a certain way, you need to put it out there and not pretend that you're a good person when you're not. The Victorian period was big into that. They were extremely, in England, extremely conscious about appearances. That's kind of a British thing, to keep up appearances. And so it didn't matter what a bad person you were, as long as you didn't look bad in public, as long as you looked good, as long as you dressed well and had money and smiled and spoke well and was somewhat well educated, the way you acted behind the scenes didn't matter at all. Character didn't count. Reputation counted. and that is condemnable, right? We don't like that. We don't like that kind of hypocrisy. Some of this I'd like for you to remember. He is from Scotland, which makes him British, but doesn't make him English. He's Scottish. I thought it was interesting that his father was a civil engineer, designed lighthouses. That seems kind of a romantic or kind of exotic type job, you know, just not bridges and buildings, but lighthouses. So he'd go with his father to these places where the lighthouses were, and I don't know if that made him sick or if that contributed to his sickness. Scotland is north, you know, the northern country, north of England, and the weather is usually rainy and it's colder, and it was not a great place to get sick. So he suffered from tuberculosis, and it affected him all of his life. He wrote children's books, and that's the one thing, one of several things I want you to remember about him. He was mainly known as a writer of youth books, youth literature, YL they call it, and that's not considered as significant or as respectable as, you know, other writers, and we'll show who some of those other writers were. But anyway, he wrote a famous book when I was a kid, when my children were kids. You know, you get about these little golden books, and they had made A Child's Garden of Verse into one of those books. So he wrote stories for children. He went to University of Edinburgh and studied engineering and law. So he was smart, he had a great background, but he didn't become either an engineer or a lawyer. He rejected that to become a writer, which probably made his family mad at him. He did pass the bar exam, but he spent the rest of his life really writing and traveling. He fell in love with a married woman, and she was married when he fell in love with her. She was traveling to America, and she was also 10 years older than him. So for a Victorian, that was definitely a problem. To us, that's no big deal. But he didn't marry her until she was divorced, but they had some sort of relationship. And then he wrote a couple of travel books here. You don't have to remember those, but I would like you to remember that aspect of his personal life. He eventually married her, and then he began. Then he began to write and publish many of the books that he's most famous for, like Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was a friend of Henry James. Henry James is considered a better writer. So is Joseph Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness. They're much, much more respected, held in esteem than Stevenson. The interesting thing about Stevenson, his esteem goes up and down from generation to generation. It's been over 100 years now, 120 years since he lived and wrote. And some generations think he's a great writer. Then his esteem will fall. Like, seems like even AP, I told you, doesn't really acknowledge him as a writer of books that they would want you to write about, although you could do a good job with it. He dies in the South Pacific island of British Samoa, and he got involved in the politics of Samoa. And he died there, and he's buried there. One interesting thing about Samoa, this is British Samoa, I'm pretty sure, because that's where he went. But there's an American Samoa, and American Samoa has an odd novelty fact about it. Per capita, per the number of people that live there, American Samoa, I read one time, has produced more NFL football players than any place in the world. Even Texas, Pennsylvania, any place you think is a football hotbed. Certainly more people came from there to play football, but per capita, American Samoa produced more. All right. All right, Stevenson, I already mentioned this. Stevenson's prestige, his fluctuated reputation. He's currently probably not very good now, but it has been better. He wrote for young people, which is a low prestige category, and compared to Joseph Conrad and Henry James, two people we mentioned, he is not considered as good a writer. I would mark Henry James. There's a book I would recommend for you. It's called The Razor's Edge. It's by Henry James, and it was the scariest book I've ever read. I don't read too many scary books, but the way it was written was especially entertaining for that reason. It's about these two children whose father is trying to hire a new nanny and does, and they either out of, I don't remember, malevolence, they're like evil kids, or they're just kids. It's hard to tell. That's the beauty of the book. They make the governess feel like there's a ghost in the house. And that could be done very comically and funny. This was not, and nobody gets killed, and nobody, you don't see any gore or anything like that, but it's extremely tense, because you never know, to the moment the book ends, you never know if there were really ghosts there, or if this was just a game. I mean, it's beautifully written for that reason. There's no way you could take either side and make a perfectly good case. There were really ghosts there, if you believe in ghosts, or there weren't, and they were just playing. All right, so we don't have much more. He's got about 5 minutes. Interesting thing about the book is he claimed, like Kubla Khan, Coleridge claimed he dreamed it. So did Robert Louis Stevenson. He said he dreamed this story and then wrote 64,000 words in 4 days. I've been writing this thing since for 2 years. I think I have about 60,000 words. Obviously, I've got another job, but that is remarkable. It's not unusual for a writer to produce only 500 words in a day. If you know how it is to write. They're going to be publishing this, so to write 64,000 in 4 days is pretty remarkable. I don't think the book is even that long. I think it's edited. He wrote more than he actually published. Yeah.
Is it possible that some of these stories could have been written because they were on drugs or something? They're under the influence, rather than a dream.
I think it would be like saying that.
I dream like the craziest shit about that, bro.
I think it would be saying that a drunk could write Hamlet. I mean, of course not. Maybe they got the idea when they were drunk, or maybe high or something like that. But to think that.
You said a dream.
Yeah, he dreamed it and then wrote it there. Yeah, maybe it was induced by that. That's possible. I'm sure there's some that have done that. All right, a couple of last things about the book. All right, a couple of last things about the book. It's a book about, obviously there are two names on the cover. So it's really about a book about the idea that all of us have, I don't believe this necessarily, but all of us have two people in us. Now, I do believe that we're not the same person everywhere we go. Some people, we know how to act better at school than at home or with our friends or with church, whatever. There are different sides of our personality that come out. We don't act the same, but the fact we're still the same person. This book is about that. It's that idea that sometimes we would like to be another person because we can do things as that other person, and it's as much me as this person is. And so this is a book about that. And one interesting thing about it, we're familiar with that idea of the two-sided person in a way. Every town, for instance, even Edinburgh, even London, has at least two sides to it. You know, the old southern towns, railroad tracks were right through it, and if you lived on the other side of the tracks, you were like considered a different person. Every town has that place in it, that the not respectable place, and then you have the respectable place. So that's sort of a natural thing. As you read it, notice how many doubles there are, how many twins there are, not literal twins, but people that are like opposites of each other, but are, you know, kind of grouped together. Here are the characters. You'll need to know these. Utterson is not the narrator, but he is this is written from omniscient third person. So he's the third person that whoever the narrator is seeing the story through his eyes. And he happens to be Jekyll's lawyer. Enfield is his friend. Enfield's not really an important person in the story, but it does continue that theme of he's the opposite. He's younger and he's sort of outgoing. Utterson is older and introverted. Jekyll is a well-known and respected physician. And I don't know if I get to it, but this book was written shortly before the Jack the Ripper episode happened in London. And some people think that, you know, this sort of motivated that, because that was about somebody, possibly a doctor, who in his, you know, at night would kill people, women, and cut them up. And he did so with surgical precision. But he was never caught. It's like no one ever knows who Jack the Ripper was. And this is a story based on that principle, that maybe somebody could be kind of have a double personality, and, you know, one of them being very evil and one of them being very respectable. And that's where Mr. Hyde comes in. And then you have the character Lanyon, who is the opposite of Jekyll. So on Monday, listen up. On Monday, we're going to officially start the book. We might even read something together in class. I have another assignment that I'll introduce too. I hope it'll be a light one. It won't be hard to do. But we do have a couple weeks. We'll start reviewing in a couple weeks for your exam and your orals. So we'll see you later. Yeah.
Mr. Powell?
Yeah.
Want me to show you my major deck sheet?
If you'll just leave it with me and just make sure your name.
Yeah, my name's on it.
No, we have to, there'll be some there.
We'll do a draft there.
Yeah, or at, I think it's at lunch.
See ya.
Hey,
Yeah.
I don't know, we gotta make,
Where are we going to lunch?
we haven't decided, we gotta make the team.